Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Tutti a Casa, brought to you by Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo at New York University. Today, we have the great fortune and the honor to have with us Victoria de Grazia, Moore Collegiate Professor of History at Columbia University and the founding editor of the Radical History Review. Professor de Grazia has published extensively on a variety of topics. She's one of the lead world authority on the history of fascism. Her fundamental How Fascism Ruled Women remains a fundamental text all over the world, but also Irresistible Empire, America's Advance Through 20th Century Europe, and many other publications that we'll probably refer to in the course of the conversation. But today, we invited her to our broadcast to talk about her latest book, The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy. It's a big book, and it got me hooked for a good 4 days, reading the stories that Professor de Grazia was able to put together. The Perfect Fascist, as she will tell us in a moment, refers to a specific character. I would say probably the most important fascist you have never heard of, because his name didn't stick to most history books, even for people who are studying fascism. But he's in all the pictures. Mussolini is always with him. He's always one step behind. So when you start hearing the name, you'll recognize how important and fundamental and pivotal he was in the establishment and in the preservation of fascism up until the end. But it is much more than that. It is definitely not a biography. It's a book of history and stories intertwined on a history that is definitely not only a background, but it's a character in and of itself in this book. It reads like a novel, but the apparatus of notes, footnotes, bibliography, documents, archives consulted is impressive and scary if I think the months and years that Professor de Grazia has dedicated to this project. In my opinion, absolutely worth every minute she spent there because of the great experience that she gives you when you read these incredibly fascinating, deep, and multi-layered book. And without further ado, I would like to ask Professor de Grazia to bring us into the worlds, plural, that she has discovered, in partly rediscovered, because as you know, as I mentioned before, this is her field. These are some of her fields, how it came about, and also to show us some of the incredible photographs that will help us put a face on the names that we're going to hear about during the course of the presentation. Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefano, for having me. I'm sorry not to visit with you at the beautiful Casa in person, but we'll get back to that. Thank you all of you for listening in. So let me begin with an image. Mussolini, 1938, and he's on maneuvers in northern Italy, near the French border. And it's a French photographer for Keystone taking a picture of comrades in arms. And here we have Mussolini, sober, and with him a weathered general who in the image looks very much like a comrade. And this indeed is the person who is at the center of what I call a social history of an individual, with his mother, with his cronies, with his wives, both one he can't divorce, another he can't marry, both Jewish, which is my way of telling the history of fascism in a new way, one that accepts that it was full of passion, full of power, full of misplaced love, and also about moral choices that were made, mostly badly on the part of this fascist in particular, but by his boss, his comrade, his Duce, first and foremost, Benito Mussolini. This man, whose name we haven't yet mentioned, thank you, Stefano, for not spoiling it, had been an army officer. He joins the fascist squads, 1920. I'm sorry, he joins the fascists, 1920. So he's with Mussolini perhaps at among the longest, 1920 to 1945, when he also escapes from Milan in another convoy, which doesn't meet the same fate as Mussolini, who ends up hung, as you know, after being shot in Piazzale Loreto. However, this man's body also appears, except it turns out not to be his. Okay? He served in many roles, an unusual number. That is, he was not just a vice president of the Fascist Party and organizer of the fascist squads in Milan, but he was also a statesman. That is to say, he was Undersecretary of the Minister of the Interior, a very powerful position. He also ended up as Minister of Italian Africa, the most powerful position, clearly, in terms of the colonies. But he was also commander of the fascist black shirts, that is the National Voluntary Militia, for 5 years. He was also a general, okay, after leaving the army as a major and then being in the reserves. He was brought back into service and advanced well beyond what he would have managed to do if he had just stayed in the army, leaving as a 3-star general, retiring as a 3-star general in 1939. He would be eventually captured, purged. He would be the first to be tried, the first big hierarch to be tried in 1945 in Milan, and he would be sentenced to a very long term, and he would end up serving the longest time in jail until 1950, and to have be virtually the only one who would have all of his property expropriated for reasons we can come back to. Now, I did not know who this man was when I first came across him. I came across him, still we're not talking about him yet, who's his name. Let's see if I can. I came across him in about 2007 when a family, a New York family, distinguished Jewish family, professional family, very cultured family. One of the members came to me through her children who had been teaching at Rutgers and asked me to look at some bags of stuff, Bloomingdale bags of stuff. And she said that their distant cousin, Liliana, who you can see here right in the picture, had married this man who was a big fascist, a spirited fellow. And she wanted to know basically how historically valuable were these papers, and on the side too, curious about why Liliana had married this much older fascist, this woman of great talent. She was a young, very promising opera singer. Why she had married this Attilio Teruzzi. And I sort of said, I really don't know who this person is, notwithstanding the fact that I had studied fascism, not that I was hugely interested in the fascist elite in my work, studying other questions, workers under fascism, women under fascism, popular culture under fascism. So it wasn't as if I was dealing with a kind of, organogram of the fascist elite that didn't interest me that much. So I asked myself, well, who is this guy? But above all, what is going on in this picture? Okay, and gradually would have worked it out. Okay, so this is Mr. Attilio Teruzzi, dressed here in morning coat, and who is their best man? It's Benito Mussolini. This is Rose Weinman. This is the father, a Jewish merchant in New York, his wife. There, Tullio Serafin, who was at the time director of the Metropolitan Opera and had been Toscanini's successor, who had also been a successor at La Scala, who was her mentor, Liliana's mentor, while she was studying at Milan to make her debut, she hoped, at the Met. He would later also be he was at the same time Poncel's mentor. He would later be Callas's mentor. This is a man who knew how to mentor and how to choose his mentee. So here is the American ambassador, Mr. Fletcher, and here is very obscure looking. The picture is not very good, probably because the old lady was moving. Teruzzi's mother, a widow who had run the family shop after the husband died very early in the 1890s, so very poor, a bar, a wine store in Milan. And here was his sister there, Amelia, who was a school teacher. So, this was the striving petty bourgeoisie. The father, Isaac, had paid for the wedding. It was an enormous affair, a double wedding. Okay, so it was the first of all, a civil wedding. Okay, this is now in 1926, but then there was also a church wedding, which had to have the dispensation, formal dispensation, bureaucratic dispensation from the Pope, because she was Jewish, which would allow them to be married in the Catholic Church, which at that point began to seem desirable because the fascist regime was normalizing and beginning to become more and more careful about appealing to the bourgeoisie in this period, settling men like Teruzzi in marriage, and as a signal to the Catholic Church that this was happening, this great wedding, which was going to be both a civil wedding first, and then right after a Catholic marriage, so that the two wouldn't consummate their civil marriage before the Catholic wedding. That was the sort of the notion here. Now, from this point, I began my search again, because I didn't know what man was. And so my question sort of shifted from an appealing American question, which was, why did this Jewish girl ever marry this big fascist? And why did the wedding end? That kind of breathless American, which would then yield that kind of response that she became a victim of fascist anti-Semitism. So what started as a kind of misbegotten strange marriage was doomed to end badly when he and they all discovered that she was really Jewish, and fascism became anti-Semitic. Okay, that was a sort of story that one could imagine from this, and one could imagine getting a very large advance from a publisher on that kind of conventional story, let's face it, where you could have the sort of Me Too story, which is combined with fascist anti-Semitism. But I had to ask another question, which was, why, goodness me, did Mr. Teruzzi, who had been a squadrista, an organizer of the fascist squads in 1920, and in 1922 had been one of the commanders of the squads from Emilia-Romagna, which had big-time squads. Anybody who's seen Novecento knows that that's where they're coming from, and he led them down to Rome. Why would he then, as part of his striving upward, have married this wealthy New York Jewish woman, and urged her then, indeed required for his sake, for his reputation, to leave the stage and become a true bourgeois wife that would accompany him and promote him and promote her into what she described as Mussolini's inner circle, a very kind of New York notion of upward mobility and the operations of a power couple. So that caused me now to set off in search of the man, chercher l'homme here, and to think more and more about how was a fascist created. Okay? Assumption is, I'm a socialist historian, they're not born, but how is this man formed, wanting to be a very good man, wanting to be a loyal follower, an aide to Mussolini, wanting a career in the fascist state to serve the nation, that's what he was always speaking about, to respect the huge sacrifices that Italian men had made in wartime, and to the sacrifices of Italian martyrs to make Italy great again. That was his way of speaking, and he had chosen this woman as his companion to further that endeavor. Okay, so this is what I began to find out about him. That first of all, this man who would pride himself on being a good fascist had been a very good soldier. Now, not a great soldier in the sense that he was destined to become a general, like, say, Graziani, who was his same age about, who also went to the Academy of Modena, that is Italy's West Point, and served in Eritrea around the same time. But nonetheless, somebody who was extraordinarily brave in battle, very plucky, very impetuous, and very, very loyal. Here we see him in one, and photographed. Okay, here we see a first photograph that I could find of him by chance at the Battle of Zenzur. He's with his officers of the 5th Eritrean Battalion, which was being hugely photographed at the time because it was the first black time that people had seen black soldiers, and they were being brought to fight in the Libyan War to get Libya snatch Libya from the Ottoman Empire. Really, it's called the Italian-Ottoman War, but the Italians call it the Libyan War. And here he is, peeking up. He's at that time, I believe he's a second lieutenant. Okay, there he is, his head always moving around. We always see him. And here we see him after a battle of Maharuga to conquer the Fezzan, that's the southern part, desert areas of present-day Libya. Right here, wounded, kind of looking very cocky, as an Arab is forced to submit to sign a treaty with the Italians that would have them drop, hand over their weapons and begin to swear their faithfulness to King Victor Emmanuel as part of this. And he had won by that time a bronze medal, 2 bronze medals. Then we will see him again now. At his return to Milan, he gets his photograph made, in a very prominent leading photographer, Somariva, who will be photographing sort of the up-and-coming people of Milan. And here we can see him, this figure in his blue dress uniform, that of the colonial officer, and we can already imagine him swaggering around the Galleria of Milan, being very much observed. This is a man who looked very good in a uniform and was always being observed. That was sort of part of him. They said he was a very reserved. He didn't talk a lot, but then he'd talk a lot about his war and his experience in the colonies, which was very unusual. Okay, so we're moving along here. We're moving along more quickly. Here we see him, goodness gracious, as an aide-de-camp of a very important general. Nobody ever mentioned this under fascism, but it would come out. It would come out. And I have very little written evidence of this. Here he is, okay, there looking, fairly stocky, big beard. There's this General Vaccardi, who's not a household name, but he was one of these great younger generals that was much admired across the Western Front among the Allies. And here, and this was striking because it shows that Vaccardi knew how to choose his aide-de-camp, how important they were to a general. This is Lieutenant Mattioli, Raffaele Mattioli here, who would become the Keynes and the Rothschild of Italy in the 1930s, and the great bankers, great patron of arts, the man who saved Gramsci's papers. Okay, at that point, this was a very young man, about 22. This is an old guy, 36, who knew how to deal with the troops. Vaccardi was very useful, clearly, to have the relationships with the army hierarchy. Okay, so we're seeing now, putting together a story. Now, what a shift over. So now all of a sudden we see a very different image of him. Black shirt, okay, sweaty. He next to another very famous black shirt from the from the area. They have taken over one of the first coups well before the March on Rome, generally unknown. The coups against the city of Milan. They threw the Milan administration out. This is in August 1922. There are coups in many of the cities of the north before the March on Rome. And here we see him now in his fascist activist role. And I asked this question, the historian has to move by asking questions, otherwise you don't find the material. Could a man of 38, because that's what he was at the time, would he have actually been beating people up, or did they leave that to the young guys, the 17-year-olds, the 18-year-olds, the 19-year-olds, and so on? And indeed, I found evidence that he had been engaged in shootouts, that he carried a gun, which was, of course, illegal then. No, that didn't matter. And above all, he was known as the organizer of the fascist squads of Milan, a difficult task because industrialists and the good bourgeoisie of Milan did not want squads. They had industrialists had their own goon squads to deal with problems. But notwithstanding, Teruzzi, because he had been a major and because he was well known, because he knew how to get along in polite society, as well as hang out with the guys, had the credibility to be able to try to organize these groups and to work with the police to raid workers, red organizations, especially after the elections of 1920, and then again during the elections of 1921, when the fascists get their first big foothold in the national parliament. Okay, so then you might be surprised, who is this guy? This is like the fifth man. This is the quadriumvirs, Balbo. Here, the four quadriumvirs, Mussolini in the center, and the paparazzo. That's a bit of an anachronism. A well-known photographer at the time, has taken his picture right in the middle. So you see him with his weapons. He's posing. He's there. Some very beautiful picture of Porti Pastorell, who would be repeatedly taking pictures of Teruzzi right down until 1940. We'll come back to another of those. So I'm seeing now emerging, lots of times working with photographs, the emergence of this man. We see him now leaping forward. This is my story, carrying this all the way through, but working always in terms of his private life, which is what yields the inside story, gets us behind the facade of totalitarianism into the sort of horrible heart of fascism. Here we see him at the very end, when this simple soldier, colonial soldier, still boasting of this past, has become now minister of Italian Africa. Here we can see him sort of looking at the sort of apotheosis. I believe this is actually a Porti Pastorell photograph as well. Yes, because it's of the Farabola Institute, where many of these ended up. Okay, and finally, again, a very good photographer sent Paparazzo to see him after while he's in prison. There too, he's a good, excellent prisoner. He becomes the assistant to the very charismatic Don Luigi Fassanaro, the prison chaplain at the penitentiary at Procida, where he stays from 1945 to 1950. Here he is kneeling as he enters into the library, where he was the assistant, where he was the librarian, a very strict librarian, just as he'd been, a strict head of squads, just as he had been a strict head of the National Voluntary Militia, just as he had tried to be strict. He wasn't a very good bureaucrat at the Minister of the Interior. But now, at the same, what this story is. So it is a narrative, but it's a narrative with has to work with themes, which I took seriously in the subtitle: love, power, and morality. Love, it's really screwed up. I mean, under fascism, it gets screwed up. And Teruzzi was particularly emblematic of this screwing up, in the sense that he loves Mussolini. He says he loves the nation, and he's faced choices, love his family, love Mussolini. He's always finding problematic his choices of women and how they align with his duty, at least as he sees it, and then as he sees his women as interfering with his duty because they do something dastardly, which they really never do, but his cronies sort of set him up. The cronies act like this collective Iago, injecting suspicion in this weak-willed man and causing him to become hysterical, and then causing him to carry out his rage, have it explode in terms of his family life. Nonetheless, what could be higher than the love of his daughter? Here is shown in a beautiful picture of Gita Karel in 1940, his daughter born out of wedlock to a Jewish woman, another one in 1938, the daughter is born, who is illegitimate. And there's nothing that can be really done about that under Italian law, because you'd have to get the wife who was estranged and living in the United States to permit it, and she never would have. And this pure love, so-called, for the daughter will lead to further complications as Italy becomes more and more liege toward Nazi Germany, and ultimately Germany occupies Italy, where they have taken refuge in northern Italy, and that will create then terrible complications because the mother is not Italian, Romanian Jew without a passport, and their questions are under Italian law that whether the daughter, she is legally Jewish or not, and how much danger she is in. Okay, we see power. Okay, very misunderstood by most people who have know Italy, sort of. Well, even Italian historians, I don't want to, younger historians are now coming around, don't realize how much Italy was at war under fascism. They assume that Italy becomes warlike in 1935, but really enters into major total war only because it allies with Hitler in the Axis, and then to invade France in 1940. Not so. Italy started warmongering in 1911 with its decision, very badly made, to join all of its powers in becoming a great empire, which its resources did not allow, and which inevitably brought it to confront the British Empire, as you can see in the area. And we find, this is a picture which is designed to show the Mediterranean Italy, and all of its connections down through here, this idea of Euro Africa. And we see Teruzzi in some ways as emblematic of the war making that Italy engages in from 1911 with the Italian-Ottoman War. But then Teruzzi is going to be very, in the World War I. We see him up here. He's going to be in the anti-subversive war, 1920 to 2022. We're going to see him back at war against the Senussi from 1926 until 1928. The war goes on until 1931, ends with the elimination of the Senussi, great genocide in 1930 to 32. We're going to see him engage in the Ethiopian War. We're going to see him on mission in the Spanish Civil War, where Italian presence was absolutely crucial to Franco's success. So one of the elements that comes through in this book is that Italy is pretty much always at war, and Mussolini's pretty clear that this is the future from his famous speech about Italy becoming totalitarian, this in 1925, when he starts speaking about all inside the state, nothing outside of the state, and so on. So this idea that Italy has to be prepared now, having won World War I, in a modo suo, to pursue warlike aims. Okay, and I think that we want to keep that in mind, and so that Teruzzi becomes very key. Not that he's a great military thinker, but he has just that level of understanding of that of the major, that of the aide-de-camp, and in effect, I think we have to think of him as kind of an aide-de-camp to Mussolini, performing some of the functions that he performed toward Vaccardi. Here we have him prized for his loyalty. He's been put in as Undersecretary of the Home Ministry, where he has that the function of reporting to Mussolini on the side, illegally, of reporting to Federazione, the nationalist Minister of the Interior. This is such an, but also on the side, he's also reporting to his good friend Farinacci, who's the secretary of the Fascist Party. So he becomes a kind of figure who works in between, also because he's weak in some ways, and he's being pressed on all sides to report and to be a figure who's in the middle. Okay. Here we see him now governor of Cyrenaica with his wife, a position he got also because it was thought she would make a very good consort. By that time, she had made a lot of friends with women of the big fascists, with Margherita Sarfatti, Jewish, with Gina Federazione, whom she thought was Jewish, who by family, in fact was, according to the later 1938 race laws, even though it was unrecognized. So she was kind of moving and shaking, and part of this, making him also the governor of Cyrenaica. Here we see him with his old General Vaccardi helping Mussolini on maneuvers. Now he's become head of the black shirts. You can see him there. There's Vaccardi. And you see Mussolini now learning about, the military, because remember, Mussolini is not at all a military man. That was typical of both of Mussolini and Hitler, that they had been in the war, that they were militarists. But between being a militarist and understanding the military, there's a big, big gap. So, and Teruzzi then becomes a very important part in keeping Mussolini kind of informed about how to act like a military man, how to think that he knows strategy, which is a very bad, has very, very bad outcomes. And here we see him now, commander of the February 1st Division. We don't see him, but this is a beautiful picture, which was turned into a postcard, setting off as part, again, this power, this war-making powers, which he is closely involved with. And finally, we see him again here, sort of cozying up to to Air Marshal Balbo, and then Marshal Badoglio, being part of the group. Here we see him in his militia with his dagger, part of this, and here we see him on mission to Franco. Okay. Another aspect of him is getting along, kind of amiability with common people. Here we have him meeting Senafi chiefs, elders in Italian East Africa in 1938. This kind of, you can see from the reactions, kind of an amiability of so-called equals in the colonies. Again, these are images. And now, we can also see that there's the whole question of moral compass. Let me just make sure I've got these right. Okay, that he becomes involved. The problem of morality, very complex in fascist Italy. The fascists claim to be moral, that they are an ethical force. I don't think that we should see that as an oxymoron. I mean, I think that there is some notion that, very powerful one, that liberalism with its individualism and the selfishness of personal interests undercut the nation and the state, which were the true bearers, the state of moral bearing. And so that, the Duce, in effect, was setting himself up as the moral empire, and especially to making then the Italian state powerful and great again. Here we see this beautiful image, a postcard, a local photographer, Mussolini standing over the Duomo of Milan on the occasion of the opening of Ethiopian War, which was blessed by the church. At the same time, we see the church as very powerful, not just the Church of Rome, this is the Church of Milan. Okay, with its sort of quasi-Protestantism, and the big moral question which will arise in Teruzzi's case is when he wants to dissolve his marriage. There's no divorce law in Italy, and so he has to take it through the annulment courts, which were the only way, as a result of the Lateran Accords and the Concordat between the Italian state and the Vatican, for Italians to dissolve their marriages. So it's not divorce, but the dissolution meant that the marriage had never taken place. And that would be the only way in which they could remarry or marry punto e basta in Italy. And so Teruzzi has to take this course, which is the first for a fascist, and very unclear whether the fascists could behave, let's say, like an American divorcees or Marconi, who had power and influence of an older style to sway the courts in terms of finding a cause to dissolve the marriage. Okay, so we're ending up with a great moral story, which then is very complicated because Teruzzi is from the get-go a libertine. He's a libertine because he was a colonial officer, and that allowed huge amounts of license to do everything in the colonies, opium, pedophilia with Arab kids, and so on and so forth. Colonial life fed into what his libertinism from coming from Milan, and a fairly open society with a lot of sexual equality advanced. It was regarded like a little Paris, Milan, especially in the popular neighborhoods. A libertinism which was probably also more than just of the culture, much more advanced for psychological and other reasons one can't really ferret out. But this man was known, and that would in the end very much I won't say just damage him, but that would become the kind of accusation that people who had been fascists, women, Catholics, a large numbers of people could buy into this idea now that Mussolini didn't know or did know that this man was a vampire. This man was responsible for the loss of the empire. This man was deeply corrupt. And that in some ways plays into why he would be forgotten afterward, that this was the person that you wouldn't want to go near. When I spoke to Professor Rochat, brilliant military historian, a Valencian, Protestant as well. He said, "Oh, Teruzzi, disgusting." We used to call him the rutting bull, the rutting bull of the empire. Excuse me, I sort of got caught between the Italian here. The rutting bull of the empire. So somebody you wouldn't even want to write about. He was so disgusting, as if other fascists weren't disgusting for their misdeeds. But this is very interesting. This, in the end, would characterize him and mark him, this libertinism, as something that was much denounced also for his relations with women, for having favored women, for having many girlfriends, so much so that whenever in Rome, old friend Pavone, who wrote a beautiful moral history of the resistance, he said, he was very young then, he said, when a beautiful young woman opened an art gallery in Rome, they'd say, deve essere, she must be a friend of Teruzzi. So that was what sort of ended up being the characterization of him. Okay, go back here. Okay, for me, I think finding my moral bearings to analyze, in other words, moral compass in this period, led me to say, yes, I mean, the moral compass under fascism was enormously confused, warped. Teruzzi, is a figure in many ways of opprobrium, notwithstanding that he was probably in the 1920s. He carried out, let's say, his administrative capacities well in terms of not being particularly corrupt, easily moved, influenced, but kept in the bureaucratic measures. If he had a strong boss, he would behave himself because basically he was loyal to his boss. But things become wildly out of kilter as Mussolini moves Italy into the Nazi fascist axis. In other words, it moves now Italy into a world of imperial power where perforce it's second to this enormous Germany with its clear ambitions to move eastward, to create an empire that will extend at least as far as the Caucasus, and bring in all the great wealth of Western of the Western Soviet Union. And here we can see him. What I find you begin to see is really repulsive, also because it has huge moral implications. The kowtowing to Hitler. Here we have what Italy can bring. Italy brings von Epp, who's the sort of plenipotentiary for colonial affairs, and they're enormously admiring of the Italian project in Africa. They use, we find from younger historians, that they use those plans to think about setting up their East plan in invading Poland, invading Russia. Here we see taking him to the opera in Rome. But what do they do in Italy, in Germany? Hitler has at that point invaded France. There we see Teruzzi with, I think his heels perhaps built up so he looks taller, reviewing the Großdeutschland regiment in Berlin after it's coming back from having invaded France. And eventually it would be turned then in the next year and be sent into Poland and then into Russia. So we're getting now the Italian fascists moving in a world where they're immensely admiring of Hitler, immensely admiring of German power, and believing that entering into the war, as Mussolini did in June 1940, they're going to be able to make a grab and become part of this European new order alongside of their comrades, the Germans. And this clearly is going to lead, in Teruzzi's case, he having now met this young Romanian woman, Yvette Blanc, in 1937. Here she is with her Romanian passport, one of the very sort of few photographs we have of her. This is going to lead to endless complication because he can't dissolve his marriage with his Jewish princess of the 1920s, whom he had rejected in 1929 on the notion that she had somehow committed some crime, that is, having a love affair before she had married, in order to embrace legally this woman. Okay, let me end here then to say that this is a very difficult story to write about. The characters, they all have their flaws, and it's not so simple to empathize. One's caught wanting to sympathize, but what ends up is a kind of empathy, which I think, for me at least, was a way of comprehending better the roots that fascists put down, how they were able to reorganize society, how they were able to play on the passions, and how people led very, shall we say, full lives behind the facade, which were completely impacted by the fascist regime. And in his case, especially with the legacy he led to his little family, whom I managed to discover, his Italian family, was part of a wreaking of an enormous violence then on the people whom the fascists ruled between 1922 and 1945, both in metropolitan Italy, but also in this colonial area, larger colonial area, which was very much tied to the figure of Teruzzi.
Vicky, thank you so much. It was such a great pleasure to hearing the story from your voice after having read it in the book. And what a tour de force for you to summarize this very complicated network of relationship, of interaction, interconnections in the time you just used. Of course, I have thousands of questions. And one of the things we were mentioning before is that opera plays a big role in this book. Liliana Weinmann, whose family came to you asking you if you wanted to take over the huge enterprise of looking into these documents and making some sense of it, was an opera diva, and a successful one. And she was in Italy with her mother as a chaperone to study voice. And she started a very brilliant and promising career. And as luck would have it, her own life turns into sort of an opera. And there are parts of your book that are operatic. And the characters in the book could also almost be characters in an opera. But one thing that I believe they had in common, both Liliana and Teruzzi, are that they were very careful about staging themselves. And I don't know whether that awareness came from opera. For Liliana, definitely. She was a woman of the stage. She loved opera. She grew up loving it, studying it, going to it with her entire family. Teruzzi sort of navigated. He was not a big opera fan. He became through her, and then he switched to cinema when cinema became more appealing and more of a weapon of mass conviction for the regime. But they're both very careful in the way in which they present themselves, in which they appear. Liliana is very careful in the people she hangs out with. She and her father are very careful about the stories that come out in newspapers and the titles. And of course, Teruzzi manufactures his own image for his career. He comes from a very humble family. He couldn't even access the Accademia di Modena, as you mentioned, but he knows that by showing value in battle in the colonies, he could gain access to the small quota that is set aside for non-commissioned officers to attend the academy. That is the open door to having a career in the military in Italy. So they have these in common. And it seems that the interests at a certain time coincide in getting together into what seems the perfect marriage. But when do things start going sour for these couple that is perceived as a perfect couple, and that both with different interests? And I think Liliana, I have a great deal of sympathy for Liliana. After all, you know, she's a young woman with a big dream to become a singer, and she studies seriously. She's not only in the fluff of the celebrity hunt. And then she meets what she thinks could be her Principe Azzurro, and she changes her plans. And for Teruzzi, he perceives her to be probably richer than she is, a virgin, a white woman, American. The Jewish thing is not really discussed much. But then something breaks, and we don't want to get into all the details. But what do you make of them as PR of themselves, as fashioning their own persona in such a careful way? And for Liliana, that will remain true until the end of her life. The attention with which she presents herself. She would never have a career on the stage, but she would be a prominent figure in New York society, and the society that revolves around the Metropolitan Opera, not on stage, but behind it. What do you make of their obsession with the way in which they present themselves, with inventing who they are?
She is totally inventing. I mean, you know, the newspaper, they sort of massage the newspaper reports, so she's, you know, very present. It's interesting how she is so aware of her self-image, even in writing her letters. She says to her father at some point, okay, keep my letters because they're going to be important. Keep them in order and don't lose them, or, you know, you'll be in trouble. You know, she's asking him to manage her legacy. She's 22 years old, 21 years old, writing these letters, which, you know, are full of everything, mostly about her career and who she saw and this and that, and occasionally, and they're restrained letters. She doesn't write about her love affairs. She says, I saw him. So you don't get much of her sense of passion for him or intimate. There's very little intimate in them. So she's always this guarded person. And and you know, the dresses and so on. And this is a kind of mask which she is part of who she is, and part of being a diva, how she understood it, part of her character. This is complex because in some ways it's the army uniform, but it's also the army notion that you've got to marry the right woman because she can really be trouble in a garrison if she betrays you. And so he's a very primitive guy. There's no question he's primitive, always. And so it's the uniform. It's got to be the proper uniform, the proper respect. People have the proper respect for him. And that of the striver. But together they really imagine, okay, it has to be like this. For example, choosing the best men, because you had a set of best men in the Italian, but between the civil marriage and the wedding marriage are several. And so choose people from the hierarchy, your hierarchy. So your boss, but Mussolini, the idea that Mussolini would be the best man, and she would say again and again, he didn't even do that for Marconi. He didn't do that for X or for Y. That's her way of thinking, invidious. He doesn't think invidiously. He thinks in terms of a kind of hierarchy of what's owed and what's duty and so on. So when he finds himself in this bind, which I have to deal with, seeing social. I can't get into psychological because that would be weighing with ideas that come, it says banality, from banalities, or, I'm not a psychologist, and in any case now psychology is a great mix of things. One knows that even if one sees a psychiatrist, it's all very intuitive. It's not Freudian, it's not this, it's not that. So I have to go by what I can see sort of socially. And this man, he finds his wife become impossible for three reasons. One, that she's away, and she's gone back to the US to straighten out some stuff. He's supposed to go there, so she's not around. The second, he's just been appointed to be head of the black shirts. So all of a sudden, this man who thought he was finally free to be the governor of Cyrenaica, to have his family around, to be both a military man and a civilian, to build the city of Benghazi, he finds himself, he's all of a sudden, for the first time, Mussolini is his commander, literally. He's commander-in-chief. And all of a sudden, he's back in the ranks. He's responsible for men. There are no women, no mother, no nothing. And his wife is away. Okay? And this idea that begins to come in, probably surreptitiously, not even said, Jewish, New York, capitalism. Hey, this is 1929. Stock market hasn't happened yet, but people are worried now about this American capitalism in the way they hadn't been in 1925, when everybody needed American capital and American liveliness and so on and so forth. The women are being pushed out in Italy too. Margherita Sarfati's being pushed away from Mussolini in 1929. She's not Catholic. She gets baptized Catholic. Mussolini is becoming anxious because Italy has become a Catholic state. So there's a lot of kind of social reasons that this man who is crying when he's notified that he's been appointed to become the head of the militia, head of the black shirts, he weeps because he can't go back to Cyrenaica where he's living well. So, but I felt when I found that the letter saying he had been crying about his appointment, and in fact, I felt like, oh gosh, think of this men who were not weak men, who cocoon themselves in this ranks and power and their uniforms that offer a kind of protection. And here he is now weeping because he's no longer allowed to have the separateness which was provided by the colonies. Okay, so that they move differently in how they understand their staging and what they want out of it. She's very ambitious for a pure ambition, because it's not, pure in the sense it's pure in a kind of, she says she wants it for Italy and for him, but it's very much also her own ambition. And he has a different structure. His ambition is for his rank, for promotion, to be a good soldier, which means to be a perfect fascist. It's a lot harder than just being a good soldier because it's so contradictory.
Vicky, thank you so much. And following up on what you were saying about the church, a considerable part of your book is dedicated to the reconstruction of these three canonical trials, the three levels, Milan, Pavia, and then the Sacra Rota Romana, for the annulment of marriage. And you also take advantage of this insight that you have going to these archived super secrets and then finally open after all these years. But it provides a very interesting point of view in one of the major relationship of fascism, the one with the Catholic Church. Fascism, just we should be reminded for our listeners who are not familiar, but begins as a very anti-Catholic, anti-clerical movement. I mean, Mussolini himself is a proud anti-clerical coming from Romagna. He's one of those that would like to hang the last pope with the belly of the last priest, and it's like that he's like fed with these anti-clerical rhetoric, and many of his followers, and probably Teruzzi too was not very much of a Bacchapile.
I think he was deeply
more of a
anti-clerical,
Freemason, anti-clerical, and all that, of course, as you say in the book, changes gradually exactly when our story starts developing. I say ours because I'm so enthralled in it.
Yes, exactly. No, you can see these changes, and boy, readers or listeners, you want to read about bad marriage and the divorce lawyers they get. I mean, you couldn't have had the best divorce or annulment lawyers in Italy. Teruzzi gets, first, the guy who writes this 400-page book coming out in 1929 about marriage under the Concordat, a Neapolitan lawyer who will become Naples' first mayor after World War II. Speaking of transformism, these people recycle themselves.
Going around the entire circle.
He got Shaloya, who is the leading jurist, Mussolini's mentor to teach him how to behave, who's head delegate to the League of Nations, Shaloya, who had been, Minister of Justice, the son of one of the founding figures of Italy. So Shaloya is her civil lawyer who protects her. Then she gets, when the annulment starts, she gets Meda, who had been the founder of the Catholic Party, to be her lawyer. He's also was De Gasperdi's lawyer, didn't work out. And then he gets the Pope's uncle, the Pius XII's uncle, the Pacelli, who is the head of the Roman, just one of the foremost Catholic lawyer to be his. So got a lot of so-called divorce lawyers, heavy-hitting divorce lawyers there.
It's the dream team of canon attorneys, and Pacelli refusing to defend Liliana, but taking up Ferruzzi's defense for the annulment of the marriage. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, you can't be simple when you deal with church-state relations but under fascism, you to say that the church supports the regime, the church supports itself and its eternal mission. And I think, historians have to understand that. We tend to, unless you're working on the Catholic Church, there's a lot of misunderstandings about how the church works. And the church jurisprudence is Roman law in a very pure form. And fascists clearly corrupt Italian courts. So this is going to be a real possibility. How do you corrupt a church court? And
as you know, and as you mentioned, because there weren't many cases of annulment. Getting an annulment was a big deal. But for some big shots, it was available. And that continues also after World War II Italy, as we know, until divorce is introduced in Italy. Ecclesiastic tribunals still maintain a sort of monopoly on the end of marriages if they were celebrated in church, and most of them were, as we know, the great majority of them. But in this case, the church remains, wouldn't you say that it remains autonomous from fascism and it doesn't really bulge in? Because probably Teruzzi, by the choice of his super attorneys and the other strings that he pulled in any occasion whenever he had a chance, he must have done all he could. And yet he doesn't get an annulment. It's like, it's like what is it, fourth, fifth, most, in the end he doesn't. And you need 2 consecutive sentences of the same kind to get it. So he doesn't get it. So, and as you said, your research proves once again this complexity of this relationship. It's not as easy as saying, and then you enter the element of Rome and Milan. And Milan being its own church with its own ritual and its own independence, and being very proud and very protective of that judicial canonical independence as well. And was this the first time, Victoria, in which you had to deal with ecclesiastic archives and documents?
It was.
How was that?
Well, when you take these documents and they're written in English, Latin, Church Latin, and Italian, and you read them, oh my God, what a story. And there's so much disgustingness in because speaking before priests leads these anti-clericals to say the most smutty, mean things, to basically to be anti-clerical. I mean, or to be swinish toward her. So all this is now, it's like in the third act of Don Carlo. You enter into this Inquisition atmosphere, dark, priests taking down. And I did go to Milan to see these sort of intersanctums, and of course it's just really a priest, but they are acting like inquisitors, or asking questions. So you read these transcripts and say, oh my God, I'll never be able to write like this. What a story. But then you have to say, well, what does it mean? In other words, why are they saying these disgusting things? What church law? And at that, it took forever to unravel. I did talk to, when read and reread, had to get the Latin translated but not when it was translated, it was impossible to understand without understanding the law, read widely, and then in the end, subjected everything to a scholar, lawyer, who said that I made many mistakes, some of which were malicious and others I didn't understand. Not malicious meaning I wouldn't, take seriously that priests could be very good judges of marriage because they had never been married. That's what he said. He corrected me. He said, they're perfectly good judges. They're the best because they've never been married. So they don't get.
Therefore, they're totally objective.
He forced me to sort of, say, okay, let me see how this law is understood internally. And so it was a very, very difficult process. I hope in the end, I got it straight. And I'll hear from anybody.
I think you did. And I think these records also provide, also because of what you were saying, that it seems that sometimes, especially Teruzzi's witnesses, seem almost to challenge with their language and their nasty comments the priest that they have in front of them. After all, they remain the anti-clerical Mussolinians.
The big mistake was to challenge Schuster by prematurely bringing in an anti-Semitic libel well before any scholars, David Kurtz or others, wonderful scholars, they all can see the the anti-Semitism coming, but they see it coming in 36, 37, and this in 35, he gets his best friend Farinacci to bring in this awful Prezzolini to create a libel, to say that
he was a former priest, right? This Preziosi guy, infamous for his libels. Yes, yeah.
Preziosi, to make this suggest that the marriage was invalid because she was a cheat. Why was she a cheat? Because the Jews always lied, had as their life end to lie to the Christians, and that's why she did it. And this then to fake the signature of Pacelli on it. So for the church, this was, one step too far. But then what comes out, and I think this is something that other colleagues haven't understood, not that I'm trying to, set things straight. That's not in any way, it's to understand the story, is how important marriage was to Pius XI. With the Concordat, he said, marriage is the basis of this religion. People get married in the church or not in the church. Marriage is sacred. It's the fundamental sacrament. On the basis of that sacrament, they bond with Jesus Christ to have children, consummate the marriage, have children, and grow the faith. So marriage under Pius, with the encyclical 1930, Casti Connubii, changes the relationship of marriage to the church and to the society. And it becomes the basis of the church saying, don't touch the bodies of my people, of people in general, because then it's going to become human rights after the war. It's understood as Christians. But in 1938, when Mussolini says he's putting through the race law, Pius says, you're not touching marriage. And Mussolini puts marriage as the first thing that's going to be touched. That is, there are no marriages allowed between Aryans and non-Aryans. Okay. And for the Pope, not because they're Jews, that's not the problem. It's because you can't touch marriage. And Mussolini says, the Pope wants us to allow Aryans to marry blacks now, as well as Jews. The Pope is saying, no, we're not, that's not it. It's, you can't, marriage is godliness, and you cannot touch marriage. It doesn't matter if it's Jews, if it's blacks, whatever it is, it's untouchable. But that's immediately interpreted as a question of the marriage with a Jew. And that becomes the central thing that Pius is going for when he begins to say he's going to make an encyclical denouncing now anti-Semitism, because it's leading to this erosion that Caesar has moved in to grab what is only God's, and that's the human body. And after this will develop into human rights talk by the church, which is it's a very, very, very interesting theme that's coming through. So the church is engaged in an enormous transformation, making claims in the 1930s with this Pius XI, a very, very interesting pope. Very, very
absolutely. And I think what you do in a masterful way is like to intertwine these crucial and central issues that will remain well after the 30s and the 40s and the end of World War II in church-state relationship, in what is considered to be the central mission of the church vis-a-vis society, role of women and men, and how you intertwine in the specific story that you tell of Attilio Terruzzi and Liliana Weimann. Liliana Weimann, the Jewish American girl who finds her right upheld by the Catholic Church, for which she remains a non-Catholic. She could marry because she was dispensed, but she kept her faith. She never converted. She never said she wanted to convert. So it's a very, very interesting element. And of course, the end, the finale of the story, there is a long finale, because of course there is this other woman, another Jewish woman, who's, as you mentioned, we saw the Romanian passport and the photograph, but they said she was Turkish, and then somebody called her La Spagnola. So very exotic so Terruzzi again goes for another woman, another Jewish woman, who is not really the girl next door. No. And there is this child, and I think he treats her horribly. It's probably one of the worst behaviors of Terruzzi, the one towards the mother of his daughter, that he loved her very much, it seems, the daughter, Yvette Blanc. He has her imprisoned and gone into internal exile in terrible conditions, and takes away the girl from from her. So he couldn't be worse with this woman. And yet, this woman keeps loving him and forgives him. And when he's imprisoned in Procida, she manages to open a little pensione just under the penitentiary to be close to him so the daughter can see it. So that's another operatic element. I mean, this is what Liu, this is like the total sacrifice, immolating herself for these man that has really no heart, it seems, even, except for his daughter, that he seems to.
Yeah. The daughter was then crushed by the love.
Yes. And then, of course, what I found interesting also was your reconstruction of these trials immediately after the end of fascism, and how much the serendipitous element of where you were captured, by whom, in what circumstances, and sometimes the difference of a few days would make the difference in your destiny, and as it makes the difference in the destiny of Teruzzi, who is not, as you mentioned, one of the men hanged upside down in Piazzale Loreto, as he was believed to be by many people. He receives 2 trials that, of course, were influenced by the heated moment, and he receives quite heavy sentences. But, for example, Graziani, that is definitely much more responsible, war criminal by all understanding of the word, gets away much more easily and with a different treatment. So even the sort of epuration system of Italy becomes apparent in all its contradictions in the story that you say. And by reading the book, of course, you are a fantastic historian. Your documentation at the end, basically the last 100 pages of the book are notes, bibliography, reference to archive documents. But of course, these characters also grow on you. How did you feel? I just want to know your assessment, personal assessment, of this perfect fascist at the end of his parable, when he walks out of the jail in Procida to stay in the pensione that his non-wife opens with his daughter, and a couple of months after he dies there. What is your final assessment of this guy personally? How did he grow on you? Did you despise him more and more? Did you go through un'altalena di sentimenti, ups and downs of feelings towards him? You and Teruzzi, tell me about it.
Thank you. Well, I have a women's group at Columbia, all the older women, and they said, "Oh God, he's so disgusting. How can you work on him at all?" And I said, "I don't know." And after a few more years, I met one, and she said, "You must be working something out. You're still working on this project." It's possibly men in uniform and difficult men. And so, he's so awful, and kept digging and digging, and then, find little tiny pieces of letter of his, and he was so affectionate, or he'd be so avuncular toward Liliana, or a little note to just tiny little scraps, literally, that this Yvette had in little pieces. And then seeing him out of uniform with a little girl and pictures, but then seeing pictures torn up of him. And I asked his granddaughter, I said, "Well, what do you think happened? It was torn up pictures." She said, "Oh, she probably was so angry at him." That is the little Maricelli, the daughter. So her daughter, who saw her mother, Maricelli, just like having the same character as him. So it's like getting handed down. And then when you start to see this, oh my God, these are like families, these people. And when you get inside, he becomes like another man with all of his faults, all of his gifts. People keep saying he's so generous. He is so kindly to his mother, who's so difficult. Loves his sister, has buildings named after them. The hospital in present-day Eritrea named after Amalia. So you sort of see that he loves these women. It becomes terribly complicated how to reason this out as an historian. At the very end, sad. And sometimes I figure I should go back and correct it and make it sadder, except that, the readers have to decide about these people in historical terms. I mean, this is not sympathy. One reads empathetically. But I did have, in the end, this image of him, if there had not been fascism, if Giolitti had managed, like you get in France, to stabilize things, or Weimar had stabilized for a while anyway.
Yeah.
This alternate scenario. So what would this man coming back from the war have become? And he would have been a manager. He would have been at the Milan Fair. Maybe he would have kept up his import-export business with the colonies. And he would have cheated on his wife. Clearly, he would have had other people around. He would have had 3 children. Maybe 4. These sort of arriviste bourgeoisie. So I could have imagined him. Impetuous, bad temper at times, very, wanting to be respected. If he had to deal with strikers, he would have fired them all. He would have voted for the right. He probably would have always been a nationalist. Yeah. So, I tried to imagine him without this fascist world in which he went to the highest, when everybody was saying he's being promoted beyond what he should be, he's out of his league, and so on. So that's a kind of way to think also counterfactually about what fascism was in Italy, and how to understand it in a very concrete way, in the building of power. What is the role that this man plays? And then how this weak man, he would have been played by maybe a Mastroianni or a Giannini. I could imagine him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Played, not by Servillo, that's too. But these men who were pretty boys in some ways, and are weak, and they're being moved up. Alain Delon. I always imagine these figures who maybe don't even exist anymore. And
Dirk Bogarde. The Visconti picks in his sort of
yes, the sort of the little men who
yes,
don't have a lot of moral core and too much passion. I was interested in this Marchetti figure in a French village, who's the policeman who's got too much passion, and it's a terrible figure, but who falls in love with a Jewish girl in it, and why what's because they represent something unattainable, because they're big like his mother, because they're full of passion, because they're different, because they're untainted by the local squalor in which he has to live, the petty bourgeois morality, which he's trying to get away from.
And they're exotic, but not the complete other as the African women would have been. They're different, but not too different. Well, they're different, but acceptable within the common.
Totally. He'd been used to cosmopolitan women around the Mediterranean. We have to think that too, that going back to Italy is very, the women are expected to behave this way and that way and this way or that way. Or there are a lot of women who are from his own class who might be looser. Working girls had a lot of sexual freedom, which we have to, and he has young women all around him who are getting favors from him, because it's the only way that women could get, could manage, not prostituting themselves, but part of their love affair was that he would help listen to their woes, and their woes were often about their brothers being mistreated, or their father's political career having trouble, or how to get a license. It reminds one of the the women around Berlusconi and how much
Yeah.
we might excoriate him and them, but these are relations that have to be understood as social relations of huge power disparities, but people playing in different ways to manage to get along.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I tremendously enjoyed our discussion. I was so looking forward to it.
Thank you.
And I would like to suggest again to our viewers, The Perfect Fascist. It's the latest book by Vittorio De Grazia, Story of Love, Power and Morality, Mussolini's Italy, and this intertwining of the private and the public. And it's not humanizing fascist. Victoria's historical compass remains very clear, and in her judgment, of course, of historical facts, but at the same time, her ability to bring in all the human elements, the social components that make this story incredibly fascinating. And your monumental work, a true pleasure to read, and a nourishment for many thoughts also regarding the present. Thank you so much to Vittoria De Grazia. I hope to see you and have you back to the Casa when time allows.
Yes, we'll look forward to that so much. Thank you.